My name is Brad Sears. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Williams Institute on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Law and Public Policy at UCLA School of Law. And thank you so much for joining us for our panel today on the 2020 election. We're going to discuss today LGBTQ electeds, the LGBT vote, and kind of implications for LGBT law and policy coming out of this election, which seems all but over. I was talking to the panelists earlier and telling them that the Williams Institute, we historically have this panel just after every major election. It's a high risk game because we're not quite sure how the election comes out. And I'm so glad we didn't wait a couple of days, but we waited a week so that we all have something to celebrate and can talk about. But not only the challenges ahead, but the great outcomes of this election and the paths that we have for moving forward. To start out, I'm going to kind of quickly introduce our kind of incredible panel that we have, and then we're just going to have a conversation. And hopefully, if you put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, we can collect those and have time for some of those at the end as well. So we are very honored tonight or this afternoon to have a couple of our newly elected LGBT electeds. And I'm going to start by introducing Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride. Sarah has a number of firsts on her belt, and she just racked up another one, becoming the nation's first ever transgender state senator in 2016. She was also the first transgender person to speak at the Democratic National Convention and at any major party national convention. And while she was in college, even as an intern at American University, which you're gonna not get tired of hearing about American University tonight, she interned at the White House, becoming the first trans person to have a role at the White House. So congratulations and welcome, Sarah. So silently Zoom clap out there. We also have a great panel of kind of law and policy experts here with us this afternoon. Andrew Flores, who we like to claim because he had a job here at the Williams Institute. He has moved on to bigger and better things. He's a visiting scholar at the Williams Institute still, as well as assistant professor of government at American University. So you see the closed world that we're in. Welcome, Andrew. Sharita Gruberg is also with us. Sharita is the Senior Director for the LGBT Research and Communications Project at the Center for American Progress. Sharita actually had class with the next speaker I'm going to introduce. So we'll go right on to Andrew Reynolds, who's research scholar and lecturer in the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And then wrapping up kind of our experts in law and policy and research that are here tonight is my colleague for a number of years, Christy Mallory, who's the Rinberg Senior Scholar and the Legal Director at the Williams Institute. So welcome everyone on the panel. This election, we seem to have been talking about this election for 4 years, definitely for all of this year and constantly for the last couple of weeks. There's obviously still discussion about this election to be had, but I would just like each of the speakers to take a moment and just kind of what is kind of crystallizing for you, kind of your takeaways about this entire process and as it relates to LGBTQ people. Senator, why don't we start with you?
I'm the senator for the 1st Senate District in the 1st state, so I feel like I'm always put on the spot first. First off, it's really great to be here with you, Brad, and with my fellow panelists, all of whom I am a fan of, many of whom I already know and have had the pleasure of working with. I think fittingly, the first and biggest takeaway that I have for the LGBTQ community in regards to this election is the historic number of out LGBTQ candidates that we elected. Obviously, over the last 5 years, we have seen the LGBTQ community, particularly transgender people, come under relentless attack by Donald Trump, Mike Pence, and far too many state politicians. And I think in many ways, the response to that has been more LGBTQ people, including more transgender people, stepping up to run, and not only running, but winning in red to blue seats, winning in purple districts, winning in obviously some deep blue districts like here in Wilmington, Delaware. And I think for me, that's an incredibly inspiring thing to see. I think it's a reflection of the fact that when they come for us, we end up growing stronger. It's a reflection of the enduring truth that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And I think it's a reflection of the incredible progress that we've made. Decades of work by advocates, activists, and everyday LGBTQ people who've laid the foundation for LGBTQ candidates to be able to run and be judged not on their identities, but on their skills, on their ideas, and their experiences.
Great. Thank you. And Andy and Sharita, why don't we go to you next with the same question?
So thank you also for hosting us and having this really interesting and important discussion. It's lovely to be with my colleagues. I would say, you know, I take away two things from this election result. One, I think quite positive, one not so positive. I mean, I think all of us would be cognizant of the fact of just what a momentous change Biden's victory represents. And I don't think that's just about the man and the victory of the Democratic Party. I think that there is a massive sort of change in ethos, in policy, in philosophy, in empathy that's going to come into the White House. And I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that that is a dramatically important moment for this country. And I think that Biden has demonstrated that one of his great strengths is picking good people. And I think he will put in really smart, really empathetic, really knowledgeable experts and ministers and public officials that are much more attuned with the LGBTQ community, and his policies will be fabulous. So on that side, I don't want to underestimate the importance of Trump's loss and Biden's victory. On the other side, what I take home from this is that before the election, we had lots of headlines about the coming rainbow tsunami, the coming rainbow wave of newly elected officials. As we'll talk about a little later on, it was a splash. There are amazing people that have come through the splash, but the actual progress in out elected officials has been pretty limited. And I think we should be cognizant as well of the fact that not a lot of the aspirations that people had for dramatic change have been fulfilled. I'll talk a little bit later about the importance of individual elected officials, especially Representative-elect Torres and Senator-elect McBride, and they are crucial in so many ways. And those individuals punch more than their weight, but at the same time, we didn't quite reach the levels that people hoped for.
And I'm going to take that baton and go with it. I mean, this election really showed the power that deep, long-term organizing can have in states. You look at Arizona, you look at Georgia, and that was investment in community building, in organizing, in speaking to folks that have been left out of the process. And what we've learned from that is we've got a lot more swing states than we thought we did if we just invest in the people in these states. And so I am so excited about taking that lesson and running with it. Because honestly, you know, I would not have expected we would be in this position with the state of Georgia today. And it gives me a lot of hope for the kinds of organizing and work that can be done. I was in Pennsylvania doing election protection on election day, and the folks from CASA, Maryland had turned out in the state. They had registered over 100,000 folks before the election, and they had folks stationed at every polling location to make sure that people with limited English proficiency would be able to vote. And we're just, the power on the ground was amazing. I know Equality Georgia has been doing the work in Georgia, is going to continue to do just incredible work with the runoff. And so, you know, we had a huge win with Biden's victory, but we still have a long way to go. The Senate races definitely demonstrated the additional organizing and movement building that we're going to have to do in these states, or else it's just going to be pretty limited what we're able to accomplish in terms of advancing equality at the federal level.
Great, that's really great. And then Christine and Andrew, why don't we end kind of this kind of initial our hot takes on the election with the two of you.
Yeah, so I think similar to what Sharita was just saying, I think I was really struck by just how politically engaged people seem to be in this election on actually both sides. For me, I thought I saw that more so than I'd ever seen in my adult voting life. And I think obviously this comes with all of this action that's been happening over the past 4 years to fight voter suppression in all of its forms and to be vigilant and organize and get people to the polls. But what I think we saw in this record voter turnout is that that's happening on both sides. So I don't think we can sit back or become complacent for even a second if we agree with the win here. And we have to know that we have to keep doing this because they're just going to continue to build it up on both sides. And I also want to say that one of the moments that I sort of loved as we watched all the returns come in was seeing the photographs of the poll workers who were, it's almost going to make me tear up now, staying up night and day to count the votes. And I've been inspired by that to maybe volunteer as a poll worker in the next election and give those people some time off.
And speaking of power to the polls and civic engagement in a high turnout election, my biggest takeaway is how sizable the LGBT vote was to the outcome of this election across numerous states as well as nationally. I'll present just a little bit kind of what we know so far about kind of the magnitude of the LGBT vote and kind of where and how it mattered. But to me, I just think that when you think about the size of the population relative to the general population, say that LGBT people make up, some estimates say 4.5 to 5% of the population. Well, their voting power was, some data indicate that it was double that. So in a high turnout year, a high civic engagement among LGBT people. And so when we talk about power to the polls, it's an influential constituency.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So I want to introduce our final speaker, another first. We are just honored with us to have with us this afternoon, Congressman-elect Ritchie Torres, who with Mondaire Jones in this election just became one of the first Black LGBTQ Americans to go to Congress. He also was the youngest person ever elected to the New York City Council in 2013, and he's just done an incredible amount of work there, including right up and through the election. And so, Congressman-elect Torres, we're all just going around and saying some big takeaways from this seemingly endless election. How do you kind of make sense of it or distill it in your mind?
Well, first, Brad, it's an honor to be here with you, and I want to congratulate Senator-elect McBride for a trailblazing victory. And we're part of a rainbow wave that swept the country. There were about nearly 600 openly LGBTQ candidates for public office that ran at every level of government. The results are mixed. I could not be more excited that Joe Biden's going to be the next president of the United States. But I will confess the results were partly disappointing. I thought since we were facing the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression and the worst public health crisis since the Spanish flu, and one of the most unpopular presidents in recent memory, that we would have the makings of a Democratic sweep, of an FDR moment, and the election was much closer than I thought it would be. Now, having said that, Joe Biden himself won decisively. Not only did he rebuild the blue wall, but he expanded the electoral map, turning Georgia and Arizona into blue states. He won more popular votes, more than any presidential candidate in recent memory in history. And he outperformed even congressional Democrats. But, I'm pessimistic about the future of the Senate. And even if we win the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, Senator Joe Manchin made it crystal clear that he has no intention of voting for the abolition of the filibuster. So I worry that the Senate will continue to remain a graveyard for progressive policymaking. But what gives me hope is we have a new generation of leadership that is younger and more energetic and more LGBTQ and every bit as diverse as America itself. And I'm among that generation, and we're going to fight our heart out and keep fighting. You know, my philosophy in life is if we do nothing, nothing will change. And we've seen in Arizona and in Georgia the power of organizing. For me, the most important lesson learned from 2020 is that organizing matters, is that organizing has the power to fundamentally reshape the electoral map as we know it. And we as a party have to do exactly what Doug Jones was recommending. You know, it's not enough for us to invest in candidates. We have to invest in expanding the electorate. We have to play the long game rather than the short game of supporting particular candidates. So those are my broad takeaways. But I will confess, the election was something of a disappointment. I never thought that a president who openly embraces white supremacy would end up winning more voters of color than any Republican since the 1960s. That is not an outcome that I saw coming. So we as a party have to do some serious soul searching, but we're about to have the gayest Congress in the history of the United States. So there's plenty of cause for celebration.
Yes, there's a lot of hope in having the gayest Congress in history ever. And I think Senator McBride earlier was saying this phrase, kind of, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And definitely if you go back to 04, 08, 12, we were on the menu, right? Like kind of these ballot initiatives against marriage equality were used to drive the vote. And it's kind of looking back how far we've come, that we are a powerful part of the vote and have so many electeds. And so, Andrew, I wanted to bring you in and to talk about some of the research that you're doing and how you're analyzing kind of the LGBT vote in this election.
Thanks, sure. I'm gonna share my screen. I made a brief presentation, so you'll be seeing some numbers about what can we learn from the 2020 election. So hopefully you can see my slides. Is it working? Just to get a nod from, okay, awesome. So just to briefly summarize the LGBT vote in the 2020 election, first thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that turnout, it was a high turnout year, but then turnout was even higher among LGBT voters. So this is just the trend since 1992, when we started asking people their sexual orientation on the national exit poll, kind of what % of people identified as LGB, and then in 2016, LGBT among voters. And what you can see is that historically, the LGBT vote comprised around 3 to 5% of the electorate. In 2020, there are 3 different data sources that you can potentially look at, maybe a couple more to get an estimate of the % of people who identified as LGBT at the polls. One is, of course, the national exit poll, so that's at 7%. Another one is a survey that was conducted by the Associated Press with the NORC that put the LGBT vote at 8%. And then there's also the Cooperative Election Study, which put the LGBT vote at 11%. So regardless of which poll you're looking at, which study, all of them kind of coalesce and indicate that the share of the LGBT vote was much higher in 2020 than in prior elections. And it seems like a steep increase. So to go from 5 to potentially 8%, we're seeing a huge increase. Now, why is that an increase? There could be a couple reasons. One is, of course, voter mobilization and bringing new people into the electorate. And then another one is just the propensity for people to self-identify as LGBT. And finally, there's also the combination of the two, that you have new younger voters and younger people who are more likely to identify as LGBT comprising a larger share of the electorate. Whichever explanation applies, it still is very vastly important to note that this is a sizable constituency comparable to other groups in the United States. And so turnout was high. The second thing I want to just point out here, and this is kind of more of a nerdy numbers perspective, But there have been numerous reports about the validity of the national exit poll, and the estimates from the national exit poll are still changing because they continue to adjust those according to the election outcome. And so these numbers are still preliminary. But what the national exit poll as well as the AP VoteCast poll did is in numerous states provided their estimate of the number of the percent or the share of LGBT voters in that state. And so what I decided to do was compare kind of just the population size of LGBT people to the estimates from the LGBT votes from these two sources. And importantly, the AP VoteCast actually tends to reflect or show patterns that relate to the LGBT population size, whereas the national exit poll is kind of all over the place. If you actually look at the estimate for New York, so in the bottom right, New York has almost 6% of the population of New York adult population identifies as LGBT. According to the exit poll, LGBT voters only comprise 1% of the electorate in New York. So that is seemingly way off. And so I think there's ample reason to have concerns over using the national exit poll to draw conclusions about the LGBT voters in the 2020 election. And I think this is important because you may have seen recent reports of the how LGBT voters broke when it came to choosing a president. And so here is the vote breakdown over time between the Republican and the Democratic candidate among LGBT voters. And in the national exit poll, so the one that I think has some inaccuracies, said that 64% of LGBT voters supported Biden and 27% of LGBT voters supported Trump, which would be the lowest vote get of a Democratic candidate in any presidential election that we have data on for LGBT voters. And it would be among one of the highest levels of support among LGBT voters for the Republican candidate. But luckily we have more than just one data point. And so we also have these other two surveys that I discussed. And those other two surveys tend to map onto the trends far, far better than the national exit poll. And when you look at the voting patterns for the Republican candidate, you actually see that 2016 actually looks like the outlier year, not 2020. So in 2016, that's actually the lowest share of LGBT people voting for the Republican candidate. And what you're kind of seeing in 2020 is that likely the LGBT voters who probably would have voted for the Republican candidate just returned to their party in terms of their voting behaviors, as opposed to saying Trump grew support among LGBT people. I think that narrative is potentially incorrect. But of course, we're still only weeks out from the election, so there'll be more data and numbers to crunch in order to fully understand this. But I do want to put out there that we should have some skepticism around that national exit poll number. And then finally, I just want to say about the importance of the LGBT vote. LGBT voters, like many other marginalized and minority groups, were likely pivotal in very extremely close races. And we know that there were a number of close races in this 2020 election. And so here I'm just putting a presidential vote choice for some of the key wins that Democrats, that Biden had in this election. And the non-LGBT vote in each of these states would have broken for Trump. So the conclusion here is, had LGBT voters stayed home, we might have seen a vastly different outcome in this election. And so bold facing all of these percent Trumps across these different states. Just to note, the numbers in these parentheses are this estimates of the size of the LGBT vote in each of these states. So, so the LGBT vote was incredibly important, incredibly sizable, and I think was consistent with prior years in supporting the Democratic candidate by a margin of 75 to about 20 to 25%.
Great, thank you. I wonder if anyone just has any other thoughts about the LGBT vote, and one thing which I hope we can discuss now or later is like, and Ritchie, I think you were getting this, what's disappointing is to see that in the face of a pandemic ravishing through so many communities, and those are the communities that are voting for Trump. How do we bridge this divide? How do we start talking across difference? And here's people in the LGBT community that are voting for Trump, that are identifying as Republicans. Even within our community, are there any kind kind of strategies or things that we can be doing to start engaging people and hopefully persuading them politically and with their votes.
You're asking me how to persuade Trump voters to be less Trumpian. It's
Yeah, just
you know, I wonder if those are voters who are just voting narrowly based on their economic interest, you know, their preference for the tax policies of the Trump administration, and I worry that among a subset of the LGBTQ community, there might be a false sense of mission accomplished. That, you know, with Obergefell, with marriage equality, you know, maybe there's a subset of the LGBTQ community that feels it can vote on the basis of its taxes. And I think that's a mistake, because one of the greatest threats to LGBTQ equality is right-wing judicial activism from the Supreme Court, right? We have a Supreme Court that might be willing and eager to overturn Obergefell, or at a minimum, radically reinterpret religious liberty as a license to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. And if the Supreme Court were to weaponize the First Amendment against us, it would have the effect of eviscerating human rights protections for the LGBTQ community at every level of government. So we might have to do a better job of just fully communicating the existential stakes of future elections for LGBTQ equality.
right. I think that's a great point. I felt that marriage equality and kind of not being married kind of brought into the movement some people who felt newly wronged and maybe had been able to pass or not so wronged before. And so there is a similarity there, maybe to reach across some of that difference. I want to switch from kind of talking about the vote to talking about electeds. And Andy, I think you reset expectations on the rainbow wave, I believe, to the rainbow splash earlier. So I'd love to have you talk more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't want us to overlook the fact that there were dramatically important victories on Tuesday. I think Ritchie, Torres and Sarah McBride sort of lead the way, along with a couple of other colleagues. And even individuals, you know, the research that Andrew and I have done seems to suggest that a new dissonant individual, somebody who brings a voice that's never been at the table before, has a dramatically powerful way of reframing the conversation, changing hearts and minds within legislative chambers. And so even the one person, the first African-American gay legislator, the first Afro-Latinx legislator, the first trans state senator, one person actually has a dramatic effect on public policy because they begin to change the conversation inside that decision-making chamber. That being said, if we just look at the numbers, I think I have to say it was a little disappointing. Congress has gone from 9 to 11. It's gone, America has leaped up to 10th in the world. It is now 2% of Congress. We have new voices there, we have new faces there, but at the same time, as Andrew pointed out, that is dramatically short of the growing queer LGBTQ votes, which we found in the primaries was close to 10%, somewhere between 7 and 11% in the general election. And if you look at all the demographic data about young people, they're increasingly identifying as bisexual, as pansexual, as gender nonconforming. And for example, at Princeton, the first year incoming class identifies as 22% queer of some stripe. And that's how the trend is going. So the fact that we've gone from 9 to 11 is important in Congress, but it's perhaps a little lower than what we could have hoped for. At the state legislative level, we've gone from 153 out state legislators to 163. There's been a net increase of 10. So we've gone from 2.1 to 2.2% out of the 7,500 state legislators in America. So again, it's a little bit frustrating when there's been such mobilization. There's been such enthusiasm about electing out candidates, but we don't see the yield in numbers. And frankly, I think it's partly to do with the political party gatekeepers. There's still a reticence to run out candidates because you think that they're a little bit of a risk. you sort of overthink the homophobia. Perhaps you overthink the transphobia. And Ritchie Torres and Sarah McBride demonstrate that a lot of constituents are perfectly happy to support smart, charismatic leaders who happen to be out LGBTQ people. And perhaps sometimes we pander to the expectation of voter bias more than it actually there. I mean, on the positive side, we've seen a flip. At the state legislative level, there are more cis and trans women than cis and bi men in state legislative office. And that's really unique when you're seeing women of color, and trans and gender nonconforming women being a majority of those 63 state representatives. And they're winning in purple states, in red states. Again, they're demonstrating that you can run in what you might think is a conservative district, but if you have a local base, a foundation, and you have a machine behind you, then you're perfectly capable of winning. And I do think at the end of the day, seeing more gender nonconforming trans women being elected is just a massive reset to the mind of American politics. When you start to see transgender and gender nonconforming and non-binary people being elected, it becomes a possibility. The younger kid, as Sarah often talks about, watching politics, thinks now they might be allowed to be involved in politics. And when I've interviewed politicians globally, they've all said that as kids, they didn't think they were allowed to be in politics because they were gay, or they were bi, or they were trans. And then suddenly they were able to break through. And for the next generation, it just opens up a possibility that many of those people jump through the windows of. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I would say my biggest celebration of November's elections are the Sarah McBrides, the Ritchie Torres, the Mondet Jones, the Stephanie Byers in Kansas, the Jessica Benhams, the Joshua Queries, the Maury Turners of this world, who are getting elected and giving voice to a community that has been totally marginalized before. Washington State now has 8 out state legislatures. Colorado has 8. They have the same as California now. New Hampshire has 7, Texas has 6, New Mexico has 6. We're seeing critical masses. For many years, there was one out state legislator and they carried the load for everybody. And if there was a gay issue, they were always the point person. Now you have a caucus and those people can actually work on a variety of issues, not just sexual orientation or gender identity issues. So, I mean, I don't think the great celebration is in the magnitude of the numbers. I think it's the fact that the caucuses, the leadership has changed and it is now much more of color and it's much more women and trans and gender nonconforming people than it ever was before. And that's what gives me most hope.
Great. And then Senator and Congressperson-elect, I wonder if you could just each kind of talk about your own experiences and kind of how gender identity and sexual orientation kind of fit into your campaigns.
Well, I'll start. One of the things that I was very conscious of was the attention that I knew this race could potentially receive from the media, from the broader LGBTQ community, recognizing that a trans person had never been elected to the state Senate before in the United States. And I think that reality, coupled with just the fact that I'm trans, coupled with my pre-existing work in the LGBTQ movement, presented a real risk that I would, as proud as I am of being trans, would be seen entirely as a trans candidate running to work on trans rights, wanting to serve as the transgender state senator. And so I, from the start of this campaign, sought to really intentionally and almost to an excessive degree reinforce that I wasn't running to be the transgender state senator. I'm running to be a state senator who was born and raised in this district, who served as a caregiver to my husband, who was focused on healthcare and paid family and medical leave and criminal justice reform. When I announced, there was a push notification from Delaware's main newspaper that said to every subscriber, trans activist Sarah McBride announces campaign for state senate. So one of the things that was a really intentional focus of my campaign was to diversify my narrative, was to make sure that voters, yes, understood that I was trans, and I'm proud of that. Yes, understood that that was an important, that diversity in government is key, but that I was bringing my whole self to the table and all of my experiences, all of my passions, all of my ideas, and all of my experiences. What I was really pleased with was that my gender identity was an issue that never got brought up on the doors, over the phones, throughout the campaign. Voters were not talking about it, with very, very, very few exceptions. And in those few exceptions, they were a handful of instances where voters had good faith, earnest questions, and more frequently, people who were just genuinely excited about more diversity in government. But 99% of the conversations I had throughout this campaign, and particularly at the local level, your day is spent knocking on doors prior to COVID and after COVID, largely phone banking. 99% of the conversations that I was having, my gender identity never came up. And I think the results, and it wasn't because voters didn't know about it. I mean, it was everywhere in the media here. It was certainly on social media. It was something that my opponent brought up and certainly tried to use against me. But I think the results in our September primary, and then again, the results last Tuesday, reinforced that to the degree that it was on people's minds, it was a positive. To the degree that it was on people's minds, it reinforced for them that I would stand up and fight for the underdog. But that generally speaking, voters weren't looking at my identity; they were looking at my ideas. And that's, I think, a really hopeful message. And I said it, as I said at the start, I think reinforces the public education foundation that our community helped lay to make within this district as much attention as it received outside of it, made my gender identity pretty much just a non-issue in this campaign. And that was for me personally, a real validation of the work that's gone into to social change in this country. And from the community, I was able to receive incredible support from legacy organizations like Victory Fund and HRC. Was able to receive incredible support from the LGBTQ community here that didn't just donate, but spent time volunteering on my campaign. And then just personally, I received incredibly inspiring, energizing messages, particularly from parents of trans young people throughout the campaign, who would send me videos with their kid just wishing me well and telling me how much this race meant to them. And on the day-to-day, you're so focused on the nuts and bolts of the campaign, you're so focused on voter contact, you don't think about the message that your campaign can send more broadly in a symbolic sense. But those messages for me were incredibly helpful, sort of getting through the day-to-day, remembering that while the hard work begins in January, we do have the opportunity to send a powerful message in November that our democracy is big enough for all of us.
Great, thank you. Congressman-elect Torres.
I had a similar experience. I came to discover that the voters were far more interested in my record and background as a housing organizer than in my sexuality. But there was an irony. I ran for office twice, once for the city council in 2013, in a pre-Obergefell world, and then for Congress in 2020 in a post-Obergefell world. And ironically, my sexuality was actually more relevant in my congressional race. For one reason, I was running against Ruben Diaz Sr., who was known to be the most homophobic elected official in New York State. He was the only Democrat in the state Senate to vote against marriage equality in New York State. And even though the South Bronx is said to be the most Democratic district in America, Diaz Sr., as a Trump Republican masquerading as a Democrat, was thought to be the front runner. And so the voters were presented with a clear choice. Do you want to be represented by Ruben Diaz Sr., who's been the leading homophobe in New York State, who embodies the politics of fear and hate? Or do you want to be represented by Ritchie Torres, who represents a new generation of leadership, who's LGBTQ, Afro-Latinx. And everyone was aware of the choice that was being presented before them, and the voters overwhelmingly cast their ballot for me as the change agent, and did not simply do so as an alternative to Diaz Sr. I was one of 11 candidates. So the voters had options, had plenty of choice, and knowingly selected the openly LGBTQ candidate. So for me, the triumph of an openly LGBTQ candidate over a powerful brand name like Ruben Diaz Sr. in Bronx politics is a powerful testament to how far we've come. And who would have thought the first openly LGBTQ member of Congress from New York City would come not from the Village or Chelsea or Hell's Kitchen, but from the South Bronx, in a place where you might least expect it. And I think if you look at Sarah's race and my race and Mondare's race, it demonstrates that LGBTQ people are viable almost anywhere. You know, Mondare's district is the exact opposite of mine. His district is one of the wealthiest and whitest districts in America. My district is one of the most Latino and African-American and poorest districts in America. And both of us won our races decisively. So I think that speaks volumes about the viability of LGBTQ candidates in 2020.
Great, thank you. And we're seeing some of those percentages in the chat, with 88%, I think for you, Congressperson Torres, and then 73%, slacking off there, Sarah, with just 73%. So better next time. I am looking at the chat. I have to say, hi everyone, and we could fill like 3 more panels with the people in the chat. So I hope everyone's reading the chat. There's like some pretty amazing people in there. And some people have noted the lack of diversity in political ideology, perhaps a bit on this panel. And I'll just say at the Williams Institute, we create all sorts of forums. I think there's some value in going deeper when you don't have kind of a wider span in terms of ideology, but we also have other panels where we do that. And as I said earlier, I think figuring out how to civilly engage across difference is an important piece for all of us moving forward. So we've talked a lot about the election in terms of the LGBTQ vote, of electeds. We're now going to switch to kind of what is possible. What did this election make possible? And it's been a while since we've talked to them, but we're going to turn to Sharita and Christy. And Sharita, the Supreme Court did not pause for election day. They were up the next day, bright and early, going at it. With the Fulton case, they heard a case on the Affordable Care Act today. I just wonder if you could offer your thoughts about the other kind of big changes happening in terms of lawmaking bodies in this country, which is the Supreme Court that we're faced with now.
Sure. I mean, I always say the courts won't save us, but they sure can do a lot of harm. And that is what I'm really concerned about. So, for example, the Fulton case that you mentioned, this should have been a settled issue. We know that, religious liberty is a important right in this country. It's a freedom that we hold dear, but there's also got to be limits. Scalia was not a liberal icon when he wrote that if we, if everyone is able to follow their own beliefs, then every person's going to be a law unto themselves, and we can't have a functioning government. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, the most Supreme Court we've had in a really long time, the most conservative Supreme Court we've had in a very long time, could completely upend that and make it very difficult for government to function and provide the services that it's supposed to provide for folks. We have done a study and found, LGBTQ folks already have a really hard time accessing the services that they need. Discrimination is widespread, and one of the avoidance behaviors that LGBTQ folks engage in pretty regularly to avoid facing discrimination is avoid even seeking the services that they and their families need, which is really problematic. The point of government services is not to create funding streams for service providers, it's to make sure folks are getting the services that they need. Unfortunately, now the Supreme Court might very well decide that faith-based service providers have a right to state government contracts, to provide services, and that they don't have to follow the same rules that everybody else has that are there to ensure people can access the services that they need, basically so government is able to do its job. This is a pretty horrifying prospect, and it could have just tremendous implications. This case was about foster care and adoption, but it could really impact every single service. We did a brief with the Movement Advancement Project and SAGE, doing a deep dive into just the really big role that faith-based providers play in services for LGBTQ older adults, which is important. And we're not saying that they shouldn't be service providers. What we're saying is they have to follow the same rules as everybody else to ensure folks are accessing the services they need. So if the Supreme Court finds that basically non-discrimination rules don't apply to service providers, that puts us in a really difficult position. We're all pushing for the Equality Act right now. The Equality Act is really clear that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act does not provide you a license to discriminate and violate non-discrimination protections. We've had numerous courts say that as well, but the Supreme Court could completely upend that balance, which is concerning. Affordable Care Act is another case. They heard it today. I am cautiously optimistic that this court understands the gravity of eliminating health insurance for tens of millions of people in the middle of a global pandemic on really absurd and not very strong grounds, but you never know. But the oral arguments this morning gave me a sliver of hope. But all this goes to really emphasize the path to victory is not through the court. It is through building power and enacting really clear laws where there's no room for ambiguity, that we are protected and what our rights are.
Great, thanks. We're kind of going to go through different types of way to kind of create change in this environment, and then we'll get to some of the questions that you've been asking in the chat and the Q&A. And so I want to kind of turn from the court now, and Chrissy, obviously the president has a lot of power. We've seen that used in a variety of ways. What's possible now with the President Biden?
Yeah, so focusing on what the president could do here on his own through his executive power. I want to just start by saying there are actually so many things that President-elect Biden could do, beginning really on day one in January. And Biden has actually committed to many of these actions in his extremely broad, comprehensive plan for advancing LGBT equality, which is truly the first time that we have seen something like this from someone elected president. So for those of you who haven't seen that amazing plan yet, please look it up. And I think it will be an interesting roadmap for us to follow as we watch his administration over the next 4 years and possibly beyond. And a lot of what Biden has already committed to in that plan and what we expect to see from the administration is not only restoring protections for LGBTQ people that were in place before rollbacks were made during the Trump administration, but also taking actions that go beyond what the Obama administration was able to accomplish. So just looking back for a minute to kind of talk about the landscape and where we are right now. The Trump administration has continually and systematically rolled back protections for LGBTQ people through executive action during the last administration. So, and those attacks have been particularly against transgender people. So, there were a couple of very high-profile things that happened early on in the administration, like the ban on military service by trans people, and the reversal of policies supporting trans students and their access to facilities and schools that aligned with their gender identity, for example. But there were a number of other things that have happened throughout the last 4 years, a little bit more quietly. So, for example, the Trump administration has consistently taken the position that in litigation that existing sex non-discrimination laws don't protect LGBTQ people from discrimination based on their sexual orientation or transgender status. And this has continued even after the court's decision in Bostock, and the administration recently issued another rule or proposed another rule that would roll back protections from gender identity discrimination in HUD-funded shelters. So this is just to give you sort of an idea of how far these policies have gone. There have been other rollbacks, even in data collection, eliminating measures of sexual orientation and gender identity from federal surveys, so the data on the LGBT people can't even be collected. So anyway, there's a longer list. I could keep going, but the point here is that all of these things were accomplished just through the executive branch. This didn't require congressional action. So I guess the sort of good news here is that they can also be reversed through executive action. And that is much of what President-elect Biden plans to do. So just to give you a few examples in line with what we've talked about and kind of how those things might play out. But again, these are just examples. I expect to see many more supportive policies coming from this administration. But, really Biden has made essentially a day one commitment to reverse the ban on military service by trans individuals. We know from our research at the Williams Institute that many trans people have served in the military. We know from the Pentagon's own research and research of other scholars that military personnel overwhelmingly support trans troops, that inclusion doesn't undermine military cohesion or effectiveness in any way. Yet despite these findings, President Trump issued that now infamous tweet attempting to ban service, which was followed by a series of policies that actually did so. So just to illustrate how quickly and easily this can be done, there were supportive policies already in place before that ban came down. So this is really just a matter of erasing the bad policies and reinstating the good policies with the stroke of a pen. So this is something that Biden has committed to doing early on. It can be done fairly easily. The agencies will then implement it as soon as an order comes down from the president. So that's one example. Another example I wanted to talk about very briefly, which has the potential to really hugely expand non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people across the country, even if the Equality Act doesn't get passed in this Congress, which is that the president can take executive action to ensure that all federal agencies basically enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock. So any of those of you who might not be familiar with Bostock, that was a Supreme Court case decided this past June, where the court held that existing sex non-discrimination laws, specifically in that case, Title VII, also prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, transgender status, and gender identity, with the reasoning that that discrimination based on those bases are inseparable from sex discrimination. So again, just to back up, even though Title VII doesn't explicitly protect LGBTQ people from discrimination, the court has now said that the law still does, under the provision that prohibits sex discrimination. So that case dealt directly with employment discrimination in Title VII, but the implications are huge. So there are hundreds of federal statutes that prohibit discrimination based on sex, and many of those are enforced by federal agencies. So and many of those are traditionally interpreted consistent with Title VII case law. So building on that history, President-elect Biden could issue an order or directive to agencies instructing them to interpret existing sex non-discrimination laws consistent with the court's holding in Bostock. And just to give examples of how far these laws go, we have the 1557. Section 1557 of the ACA, which prohibits discrimination based on sex and healthcare. We have protections in the Fair Housing Act from discrimination based on sex in housing. So there, this can get you almost there. It's not quite what the Equality Act is. They wouldn't be express protections necessarily. And one big hole is that there's no federal non-discrimination law that prohibits sex discrimination in public accommodation. So that's one thing that the Equality Act could accomplish. And then, another thing that the president could very easily do, similar to legislation that's been introduced in Congress but hasn't passed, and something that is near and dear to our hearts at the Williams Institute. You know, we crunch numbers and analyze data and try to get sexual orientation and gender identity measures added to every survey wherever we can, is that the president could actually greatly improve and expand data collection on LGBTQ populations by instructing federal agencies to include measures of sexual orientation and gender identity wherever other demographic information is collected in federal surveys. And a lot of what we know about the LGBTQ population already comes from data collected through federal surveys. This is already being done on many of the biggest federal surveys, but most of them don't ask these questions, even where they do ask other questions about sex and race and national origin. Of course, you know, collecting these data would be so important for continuing to advance LGBTQ rights. It would give us really valuable information about LGBTQ populations who are most marginalized along multiple identities, including people of color and seniors and people with disabilities. So data collection in that sense is kind of just a beginning. We need that to ensure that future policies are reaching and meeting the needs of the people we need to serve. So I would say that, you know, again, this is just a few examples that I pulled out to talk about today, but really just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, Biden's plan includes policies on criminal justice reform that are LGBTQ inclusive, policies on youth to ensure that LGBTQ youth are treated with respect in schools and have access to facilities that align with their gender identity. And the list goes on, but I'm just hopeful that there will not only be a restoration of good policies, but a true expansion.
Great, thanks a lot, Christy. I want to turn finally to the legislative bodies, and we'll start with state legislatures. And Sarah, I think we didn't do as well in state legislatures as we'd hoped in this election, including flipping some to maybe get some more policies passed. But what is possible, and what's the outlook in terms of what's possible out of states?
Well, first off, I think, you know, we've talked a lot about the right-wing shift of the courts over the last several years, and obviously the particular danger that comes with an even more packed right-wing Supreme Court. And I think obviously first and foremost, state legislatures have an important role in being safeguards of our democracy, of protecting our rights, our dignity, our health, and particularly those state legislatures where Democrats have a Democratic trifecta, which has grown. Just a couple of years ago, you could count on one hand, I think, the number of states with Democratic trifectas. Fortunately, that number has grown. Those state legislatures can protect their residents from many of the dangerous outcomes that could come from a Republican-packed Supreme Court. But obviously, even beyond that, state legislatures, one of the reasons why I decided to run is because state legislatures are really the place where the rubber meets the road on public policy, where you can effectuate change on a whole host of issues, ranging from education to criminal justice reform, to healthcare, to economic justice. And beyond that, I think because of the gridlock we've seen in Washington, I certainly agree with Congressman-elect Torres's comments about the sad state of the U.S. Senate and sort of the best we can get from there would be a 50-50 split that still keeps the filibuster. That state legislatures are uniquely positioned to be the laboratories of democracy for bold ideas and solutions that meet the scope and the scale of the challenges that we face. And I think that as we recover and rebuild from the COVID-19 crisis, I think state legislatures are in a position to help us reimagine our society, to meet the imagination that we've been called to use to navigate this crisis, to really bring about the kinds of meaningful policies that people need to meet this moment with meaningful action, to learn the lessons of this crisis. I've run my campaign on, for instance, the need for universal paid family and medical leave long before COVID. But whether it's COVID or cancer, we know that no one should have to give up their income in the face of illness. And so these innovative progressive policies, these common sense progressive policies that we want to see, whether it's a public option through Medicaid at the state level, whether it's universal paid family and medical leave, whether it's the really significant reimagining of the criminal justice system that we need. State legislatures are either uniquely positioned to deliver results because of their power or uniquely positioned to deliver results given the gridlock in Washington. And I'm really excited about the potential we have here in Delaware, the first state to live up to that responsibility of leading this nation, of being that laboratory of democracy for the ideas that we want to hopefully see Congressman Torres, Congressman-elect Torres and his colleagues deliver in Washington.
Which is a great segue to Congressman Torres for deliver in Washington.
Yes, so while Congress is languishing in gridlock, I get to admire effective governance at the state level. Look, the landscape is complicated, divided government is complicated, but I'm cautiously optimistic that even with divided government, we're going to have a fighting chance of passing a massive stimulus package. And one of our highest priorities should be to stabilize state and local governments. You know, as a former city council member, I know firsthand that state and local governments are at the forefront of providing vital services. You know, so only the federal government can run a deficit, and only the federal government is in a position to stabilize state and local governments, as well as our public transit systems like the MTA. You know, our highest legislative priority is going to be the Equality Act, you know, which would amend the Civil Rights Act to protect against discrimination in matters of employment, housing, public accommodation. I'm skeptical that the Senate will support the Equality Act, but even if we do pass the Equality Act, it's not as if that's the end of the mission. You know, I think, you know, just like we have to put racial equity at the center of everything we do, we have to put LGBTQ equality and equity at the center of everything we do. You know, whether it's housing, we have to ensure that when we're investing in affordable housing, we're creating housing that's culturally competent, that's tailored toward the needs of LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ seniors and the trans community. So even beyond the Equality Act, there is a value in LGBTQ representation in Congress, that the people who are in the room are constantly thinking about what are the distinctive needs of the LGBTQ community, and our needs should be a factor in everything we do, not simply an LGBTQ exclusive legislation.
That's great. We're now going to turn, and I'm just going to pick up right in a second, right back off of that. But we're going to turn to Q&A. So keep your questions populating in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm going to kind of group some things together and try to hit on a lot of the things that keep popping up in the chat. You've asked some great questions, a lot of questions. I guess a first major theme is kind of on engagement, and obviously engagement of the LGBT community was so important in this election, both in terms of voting, elected. Now there's opportunities to be in the Biden administration. There's opportunities to be nominated at the state, local, federal level, to be judges for other positions. What are some of the pipelines that are out there? Sarah, I think you mentioned the Victory Fund, but if anyone can just share for everyone listening who wants to be more engaged, what are some of the pipelines out there? And what were some of the effective leaders or ways we kind of turned out the vote, to be another take on this questions. But what are the pipelines out there for engagement?
Specifically LGBTQ or?
Yeah.
I'm only aware of the Equality PAC, which is specific to Congress, Victory Fund, which operates at every local level of government, and an HRC. That's the infrastructure. You know, and I think one of the legitimate criticisms of the Democratic Party is that it focuses more on supporting candidates rather than expanding the electorate. It seems to me, rather than have every institution operate in silos, the party should partner more closely with organizations like HRC and the Victory Fund in the hopes of generating higher turnout from LGBTQ voters. And we should do the same with African-American organizations and Latinx organizations I think there has to be a paradigm shift in the direction of organizing.
I'll just mention Julie put in the comment section the link to the Presidential Appointments Initiative at the Victory Institute, which I know is working closely with the Biden transition team, the Biden-Harris transition team, to make sure that we have the most diverse administration in history with a record number of LGBTQ appointees, openly LGBTQ appointees at various levels too. I know many of us would like to see LGBTQ representation in the highest levels of the Biden-Harris administration. Similar to Congressman-elect Torres's comments about Victory Fund, HRC. One of the things that I've been really heartened by throughout this campaign has been the prioritization of both diverse candidate pools, but particularly LGBTQ candidates, among some of the intersecting electoral organizations like Emily's List, like Run for Something, who have really, I think, increased their prioritization of making sure that they're, in Emily's List's case, not just supporting pro-choice Democratic women, but pro-choice Democratic women who live at the intersection of other marginalized identities. Similarly, Run for Something, I think 25% of their candidates that they supported this cycle were LGBTQ. And so I'm really heartened to see more organizations in the progressive space prioritizing and uplifting LGBTQ voices.
Great. Other thoughts? There are some great links in the chat. There are resources out there if you want a job in the administration, or if you want a job, if you have that opportunity locally, if you want to become a judge, you can run, and there's support there. So I would encourage everyone to explore that, whether they're in the links or reaching out to your local or national LGBT organizations to get involved. I guess there has been a number of questions about the Equality Act, and I'll kind of chart a few of them out there, then people can jump in. The first is, are there really prospects for its passing? Does it depend on Georgia? Is it possible to get some Republican senators to join, or enough to pass? So it's just kind of, what is the political possibility after this election? And I think the second set of questions is about the content of the act. And obviously the move from the Employment Non-Discrimination Act to the Equality Act was a big rethinking of what was possible. Are there other things that we should be thinking, or that people are thinking about and looking at now to even expand the act to be even more inclusive? I think, Sarah, I think you were talking about earlier about all the different ways people identify. Is this the act for this moment, or for the moment when it gets passed, or do we need to do some further work? So political possibilities, and then considering some of the substance of the act.
I want to be honest. I am pessimistic about the prospects for the Equality Act as long as the filibuster remains in place. One Republican is in a position to derail the legislation, so I'm pessimistic. The good news is that the Democratic Conference unanimously supports the Equality Act. Like the issue of marriage equality and LGBTQ equality has been fully resolved within Democratic circles. It is a universal position. My understanding is that the Equality Act exempts the military. So I'm not privy, I'm new to Congress, so I'm not privy to the negotiations that led to the exemption from the military, but my sense is in order to get to a unanimous agreement, there must have been some agreement to exempt the military. So I think that is a gaping hole in what is otherwise a comprehensive civil rights protection.
Thank you. Sharita, I saw your mic go off. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I could just jump in for a second. So, all roads lead to Georgia right now. And I think any possibility of Equality Act passage depends on Mitch McConnell not being the majority leader of the Senate. Any hope of passage of a lot of things that this country needs that aren't just, well, he won't confirm judges under President Biden, but any action really depends on getting Mitch McConnell out of being Senate Majority Leader. We also have another Senate election in 2022. And I think folks are going to be, there's a lot of Republican senators up for election in that year. And, it might not be the first thing out the gate, but folks will be looking at how the 2022 election goes. So I think we have a lot of opportunities to continue to elevate this issue and keep building momentum around it. And for the military piece, just to clarify, the Equality Act updates the Civil Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act didn't touch the military. And so that was just expanding existing protections in the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And so for the military fix, there's definitely other avenues out there that are focused on military employment. And there's a really strong argument to be made that Bostock should be applied to non-discrimination in military service as employment. So lots of opportunities for addressing both, making the military as inclusive as possible, and also addressing the HIV ban in military service, which is another thing that we're definitely going to have to do. But as you said, we are not there yet on the Equality Act. The weird thing, not the weird thing, because that's how our government is structured, but the Equality Act is popular among voters. You look at PRI's research, it has polled at over 70% support across the country and for years now. And that's not just the blue state, red state, or Dems versus conservatives. It is across party lines, across religious backgrounds, every single state in this country. The support is there, and how do we turn that support to urgency and make this issue that our representatives know that they are going to have to vote on and be supportive of?
And can I just sort of build off a little bit of what Sharita mentioned? I had the pleasure of working with Sharita in that ENDA to Equality Act stage, and just marveled at Sharita's incredible legal mind and understanding of federal civil rights laws. I think a couple things just to build off of those points. I think that to Sharita's point, the most significant question around passage of the Equality Act is who controls the calendar and the schedule of the US Senate. I do believe that if the Equality Act was scheduled for a vote, we would be able to pick up a not insignificant number of senators on the Republican side. Whether we would hit 10 senators needed to overcome a filibuster is a tall order. But I do believe that if it were brought to the floor, a number of GOP senators would vote in favor of cloture and in favor of passage. So obviously the Georgia races are incredibly important in determining who controls the schedule of the US Senate. There are a number of components of the Equality Act that I'm particularly excited about. Sharita has mentioned a number of them. One of the things that's so important about the Equality Act is that it doesn't just provide explicit protections for the LGBTQ community. It also enhances and modernizes our federal civil rights laws across the board. It adds in sex where it's not currently present, including in public accommodations, and it modernizes the public accommodations section of the Civil Rights Act to reflect the full breadth of our economy, the full breadth of our society, because the way it's currently written, the way it was written in '64, is fairly limited. So one of the things that I love about the Equality Act is that it enhances protections for people of all backgrounds, not just for the LGBTQ community. And Sharita, I did have a question for you because this did come up a couple times in here. My understanding is that the definition of sexual orientation being heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality, that the way that homosexuality and bisexuality has been interpreted by the courts is fairly broad. Similarly, because it's not just around the identity of someone being heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual in the context of the language, it also includes the perception of being a member of that group. And so even if a person identifies as pansexual or queer, while that's not technically the terminology used in the act, that the language itself is interpreted fairly broadly, and that the language around perception or the interpretation of perception of LGBTQ identity is pretty important. So could you just speak to that since that was brought up?
Yeah, definitely appreciate the flag. And it's kind of a twofold thing. One is trying to keep aligned with what's kind of already been passed that folks understand, that courts have interpreted. And you're right, it's really, and we run into this also in, I did immigration law by training. And when you're talking about what your particular social group is, it's really based on how you're perceived. And a lot of these protections are around kind of, and this also talks about perceived identity, is how folks are treating you based on their assumptions about you. And I also wanted to flag, in the same way that folks who are a-religious or don't have a religious affiliation are protected under our prohibitions on discrimination based on religion, that's also extended to other categories. And so, again, folks were very intentional about using the Civil Rights Act as the vehicle so that we could build off of past interpretations of these statutes that were pretty broad. Again, we don't want a lot of new stuff going before this court, or a lot of these courts where 1 in 4 federal judges are a Trump appointee. And so really trying to build off of clarifications that have already happened that have the most expansive interpretation for these protections as possible. And so with that as well, the courts have said, even though it's not explicitly there, that also protects both the absence of either this identity or the faith or other protected characteristics, as well as the explicit ones. But I mean, I definitely appreciate that point. There's a whole lot of stuff that if I had the pen and was writing this, I would have written differently. But I think these all speak to kind of the give and takes that are based on coalitions doing this work and changing something that is such a cornerstone of protections for so many different communities.
Yeah, and which is a great lead into kind of the next kind of theme that's coming up through the chat. And I think one of the things Christy and I have been working on, kind of more on the executive side, is trying to get intersectional and multiple discrimination explicitly prohibited in non-discrimination provisions. So that isn't a matter of court interpretation, but it has the force of either the executive order or the regulations that are out there. There are a lot of there obviously kind of are intersecting identities, the way that race and gender and education, if you break down the vote in this election, when you think about the issues that the LGBT community has shown up for, is starting to show up for, I think a lot of the discussion is around, are we embracing kind of the full diversity of our community in what we think is on our gay agenda? And are we showing up as coalition partners to the extent that we should be? I was, for 1 second glanced at my phone and saw that unfortunately today is the highest day of hospitalization for COVID-19 cases. Over 60,000 people are hospitalized today. Another kind of good example of how kind of class and race and ethnicity create the world that we live in. In thinking about this election and thinking about what lies ahead, how can we work better in coalition? What are the issues that should be part of our agenda?
It's a hard question to answer. That's why no one's never. I think look, I think there are those in our community who take the broad view and who value intersectionality and solidarity, but there are elements. I feel like the LGBTQ community is less supportive of the trans community than it should be. It's less supportive of LGBTQ people of color than it should be. And that's why it's important to have the right representation, right? It's hardly an accident that, at least from my standpoint, that when Alfonso David became the head of HRC, it was suddenly HRC was investing real resources and shining a spotlight on the epidemic of violence against trans people of color. So I think that's a powerful illustration that representation matters, and that even within our own community, there's classism, there's racism, there's transphobia. The LGBTQ community by no means is exempt from discrimination for all our intersectionality and diversity. So we certainly need to do self-policing.
And just if I can jump in there, I mean, one thing that strikes me, especially as a white cisgendered Englishman in the queer community, is the very, the desert of voices of younger LGBTQ people of color. And if you look at the indicators, the metrics of just, quality of life, and I think, Brad, you were intimating this, but, incarceration, homelessness, food insecurity, poverty, and a whole raft of issues that marginalize young people from their peer groups within society, adoption and fostering and a whole raft of things where the pressures upon an LGBTQ youth in America, especially an LGBTQ person of color who's younger in America, are massive. And, I just moved from North Carolina, where I lived for 19 years. And I know Sarah was very, very involved with this work at the time of HB2, the bathroom bill in North Carolina. But when we looked at the suicidality rates of young trans kids in high school and middle school in North Carolina, and there was anything between 1, 3, 4,000 transgender nonconforming kids, those rates spike when you're demonized to something like 2/3 of the population attempt suicide. It is a horrific, oppressive climate to live within when you are told that you're not valid as a person, as a human being, especially as a young person finding your way in society. And again, I think as Congressman-elect Torres points out, we tend to celebrate the wonderful achievements of marriage equality, the wonderful achievements of tax policy, of things that really make love more apparent in the world. But at the same time, those public policy questions that affect that 13-year-old or 14-year-old who happens to be a young Black kid growing up in North Carolina who is bisexual or trans, and their vulnerability is massive. And I think that we tend to sort of find those questions are tough, and the compromises with conservative Democrats and Republicans are tough. And we sort of say, well, let's move on to easier issues. So I do hope that in this new Congress, attention is still paid to that emerging generation of people who are quite comfortable identifying as queer in some way, but also are very vulnerable to the climate that they live within. And they don't see, I mean, the amazing thing about Ritchie Torres and Sarah McBride is they've never seen a person that looks like them elected to a legitimate, authentic position of power. They don't see gay Black teachers. They don't see the judges. They don't see the doctors around them, the social workers. And so having your congressman or congresswoman be a person who looks like you is a dramatically empowering thing. And I don't want to lose sight of the importance of that community as well.
Great. I'm going to turn to just giving everyone kind of maybe some final thoughts. I want to give a shout out to kind of Center for American Progress and kind of the work that they and others did on the Affordable Care Act, because I thought it was a good example of what Congressperson Torres was saying, which was mobilizing the LGBT community for a broader policy that obviously had a disproportionate benefit to our community, but to a lot of communities, and really thinking through that statute to make sure that it worked for us and others, all the way from getting it passed and then getting people enrolled. So I think there are examples out there of how we can kind of be all in because it helps a lot of people. I want to, we're just maybe not even done with this election, not quite yet, but we've got one coming up in 22 and 2024. As you think ahead for lessons learned from this election, what do we need to build towards? What do we need to be doing as we think ahead to the next ones? And why don't we start with the Andrews, and then go to Christy, Sharita, and then Sarah and Ritchie. So Andrew, Flores, and then Reynolds.
Sure. I would just say keep the energy and momentum. Keeping people fired up and engaged in the upcoming elections is going to be incredibly important. This was a high turnout year, and so the next elections just need to continue to be as high turnout as this year. So it's really easy for presidential election years to have these high turnouts, but then to get to 2022 and to see that turnout drop off. And there is a general trend that the party that's in power tends to lose voters in terms of just getting people to the polls. So, so that would be my big thing looking into the future.
Great.
Yeah, and I just sort of reinforce this notion that it's not really the voters that are the hurdle to increasing voice for the LGBTQ community in America. It's as much the gatekeepers of party politics, the donors, the bigwigs, the elites of the headquarters of party machines in states and local levels. And all of our political candidates will have experienced the difficulty of getting that nomination, getting to the point of being a credible candidate in a progressive or a moderate district. And so I would just hope that the Democratic Party especially, but to some extent the Republican Party, starts to invest in LGBTQ candidates of whatever their political persuasion, because they are capable of winning and they bring a distinct and very empowering voice to the table. So it's not just the voters, it's the party machines as well.
Great. Christy, then Sharita.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have a good opportunity right now, maybe where we're not expending so much energy worrying about the next anti-trans policy that's going to come down, or fighting just to maintain the progress that's been made, but to really make some headway in talking across the aisle and figuring out where we have common ground and how we can together advance policies not only for LGBT people but for all people, and make sure that we come out of this pandemic as economically secure and healthy as we can for everybody. And then from there, make progress with all included.
Yeah, I'm going to build off of all this stuff. And, you know, we've got to make sure that we are passing laws that restore our democratic structures, because unless we have that, as I said, Equality Act is really popular. Protection for LGBTQ folks is really popular. A lot of these assaults on our rights are not as popular, but we don't really have a government that reflects that. And so the House passed so many really crucial bills to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act, to restore a lot of our protections for voters, a lot of representation for folks, get rid of corruption, and get money out of government and things like that. And these seem like not LGBTQ issues, but when you look at the barriers to having our voices and having elected officials that represent us, this is an LGBTQ issue, and so crucial for making sure that we have elected representatives who are going to actually represent us, and that our voices, particularly LGBTQ folks of color and trans folks who are often disenfranchised, are able to access the ballot and vote and count.
Great. Senator.
I think that the points that have been made throughout this evening about the importance of investing in expanding the electorate and investing in making sure that more people can access the ballot box is key. As has been previously said, we're going to enter a cycle that, for those of us who consider ourselves Democrats or left of center in some capacity, are going to face some headwinds, and making sure that we're starting early, making sure that we frankly don't take sort of too much time. Elections are right around the corner. Here in Delaware, we're all going to be up on the ballot at the state legislative level, because we'll all be in new districts. That's going to be true in a number of other places as well. So recognizing that we've got a lot of work ahead of us, we've got to start now, and that includes advocating at the state level for measures, whether you're in a blue state or red state, that expand access to the ballot box, passing universal vote by mail, making sure that folks who are reentering society have their voting rights restored. Those types of measures, I think we can pass in the next few months and make sure that more people can vote and more people can access the ballot box come November 2022.
Congressperson.
Is it my turn, or I don't know?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just I would echo what Sarah said. organize, organize, organize. I think the research of the Williams Institute demonstrates the decisive power of the LGBTQ vote. I was startled by the presentation that you gave, and everyone knows the decisive power of the African-American vote in Georgia, the decisive power of the Latino vote in Arizona. Everyone should know the decisive power of the LGBTQ vote, and we need to do more to communicate it because we have become a force in presidential politics, and the research that you presented was compelling. I think second, we have to ensure that, you know, the LGBTQ movement is not only fighting for the priorities of the donor class, but the full range of issues and interests that affect our community. And look, we should be proud of the progress we've made. We know we're on the right side of history. We have a president and vice president who strongly supports LGBTQ equality. But despite all the progress we made, we can never lull ourselves into a false sense of security. We have to keep fighting. We have to be vigilant as we've ever been.
Great. I want to thank you and thank all of our panelists. I hope you give them an applause out there. And thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. And this is the start of a great 4 years. So thank you.
Thank you.